a galaxy burned. 1,000,000 worlds became funeral pyres, their light choked by the smoke of ambition. The dream of a unified humanity, a golden age forged in the crucible of a great crusade, shattered into 1,000,000,000,000 pieces of scorched armor and broken stone. This was not the work of a single moment, nor the treason of a single man. It was a failure that cascaded through the stars, a symphony of errors played out across a decade of ignored warnings, misread loyalties, and chances for salvation that were squandered with an almost liturgical precision. The fall was not an event, it was a process. A slow, agonizing unraveling of brotherhood, of duty, of truth itself. At its heart stood a figure of impossible radiance and fathomless shadow. The Emperor's most favored son, the master of the 16th Legion. It was he who would give this galactic civil war its name, a name that would be cursed and wept for 10,000 years, the Horus Heresy. To understand the scale of the tragedy is to first understand the scale of the hope that preceded it. The Great Crusade was the most monumental undertaking in human history, a torrent of steel and faith that swept across the galaxy, reclaiming lost worlds and uniting scattered peoples under a single banner of secular reason. At its head were the Primarchs, 20 demigods created in the Emperor's own image, each a master of war and a beacon of humanity's potential. For 2 centuries, they prosecuted this war of reunification, their bonds forged in the shared fire of 1,000 campaigns. Yet it was in the very triumph of the crusade that the first hairline fractures appeared. The Emperor, architect of this grand design, withdrew from the front lines. He returned to Terra, sequestering himself beneath the Imperial palace to labor on a secret project of world-altering significance, leaving the final stages of the crusade in the hands of his sons. To lead them, he created a new title, one of singular authority and crushing weight, War Master, and he bestowed it upon Horus Lupercal. This was the first failure, though none could recognize it as such. It was a failure of communication, a father's departure without adequate explanation. To the Primarchs, it was an abandonment. They, who had fought and bled for 200 years to realize their father's vision, were now expected to complete it without him. The Emperor's silence created a vacuum, not of command, but of purpose. What was the ultimate goal? What came after the last world was brought into compliance? The Webway project, the true object of the Emperor's labor, was a secret held so closely that its concealment bred resentment and suspicion. In its place, rumor and jealousy festered. Why Horus? Why was one brother elevated above all others? To men like Perturabo, who craved recognition, it was a slight. To Angron, who despised all authority, it was a chain. To Robout Guilliman, who saw it as a logical necessity, it was still a concession of his own legion's primacy. The title of War Master did not unite the Primarchs, it stratified them. It placed upon Horus a burden of expectation no single being could bear, and it planted in the hearts of his brothers the first bitter seeds of envy. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's regent, attempted to manage the egos and anxieties of these demigods, but he was not their father. His counsel was that of a statesman, not a patriarch. The wound was one of the soul, and it could not be healed by simple diplomacy. The stage was set not by a villain's ambition, but by a father's well-intentioned yet catastrophic neglect. The first overt sign that the soul of the Imperium was sickening came not from Horus, but from another of the Emperor's sons. Lorgar Aurelian, the Urizen, Primarch of the Word-Bearers, had always been a seeker of truth. Where his brothers saw conquest, he saw conversion. He built monuments to his father not of stone, but of faith, raising up the Emperor as a divine being. This was anathema to the imperial truth, the core tenet of secular rationalism upon which the new age was to be built. The emperor's response was not a quiet word, not a private correction. It was a public and brutal humiliation. He ordered Guilliman and the Ultramarines to raise Monarchia, Lorgar's perfect city, a world built as a testament to his devotion. Before the assembled ranks of the 17th Legion, the emperor chastised his son, forcing him to kneel in the ashes of his greatest creation and renounce his faith. It was a lesson taught with a mailed fist, intended to enforce compliance. It achieved the opposite. This moment was a catastrophic failure of empathy. The emperor, a being of unimaginable psychic power and intellect, could not or would not see the wound he was inflicting. He treated a son's love as a tactical error. The other Primarchs, for their part, were silent. Guilliman carried out the order with cold efficiency. Rogel Dorn would have seen it as a necessary, if unpleasant, enforcement of protocol. Mortarion would have approved of the blow against superstition. None of them, it seems, reached out to their shamed brother. None saw the danger in forcing a man of such profound spiritual hunger to starve. Lorgar's humiliation was not a secret. It was a spectacle, and in that shared silence the brotherhood proved itself hollow. Broken and disillusioned, Lorgar sought a new truth, a new power worthy of his veneration. Guided by his corrupted lieutenants Erebus and Cor Pharon, he journeyed into the Eye of Terror. He went seeking gods, and in the roiling depths of the warp he found them. He became the first of the Primarchs to pledge himself to chaos. Not for power, not for glory, but because the ruinous powers offered him what his own father had denied: acceptance of his faith. The poison that would one day infect Horus was first brewed in the bitter heart of Lorgar. His fall was the Imperium's second great failure, a direct consequence of the first. It was a cry for help that was answered only with scorn, and the galaxy would pay dearly for that deafness. If Lorgar's fall was a quiet turning in the dark, the next warning was a psychic thunderclap that shook the foundations of the Imperium. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, was a being of immense psychic talent, a scholar whose thirst for knowledge led him to tread paths others feared to walk. He knew of the powers that dwelt within the warp, and he believed they could be understood and controlled. This pursuit of forbidden lore put him at odds with brothers like Leman Russ and Mortarion, and led to the Council of Nikaea, where the Emperor, in another critical misjudgment, forbade the use of psychic powers by the legions. This edict, known as the Nicaean Crusades, was a blanket prohibition that failed to distinguish between the careful art of the scholar and the reckless abandon of the warlock. It was a political solution to a metaphysical problem, and it blinded the Imperium at the moment it most needed to see. For Magnus, through his own scrying and esoteric studies, saw the truth. He saw the corruption taking root in his brother Horus's soul after he was wounded by a chaos-tainted blade on the moon of Davin. He saw Lorgar's chaplains whispering poison in the War Master's ear. He saw the full scope of the coming betrayal. In a desperate act of loyalty, Magnus chose to break his father's edict in order to save him. He gathered the power of his legion and cast his consciousness across the galaxy, not as a whisper, but as a psychic battering ram. He tore through the intricate psychic wards of the Imperial Palace, wards the Emperor had spent decades constructing to shield his Webway project from demonic incursion. The message arrived: a torrent of pure, terrifying information. Horus is a traitor. The crusade is a lie. The galaxy is on the brink of civil war. It was the most important warning in human history, and it was met with fury. The Emperor saw not the message, but the catastrophic damage done to his great work. The breach in the wards allowed demonic entities to flood the human-built sections of the webway beneath the palace, turning his dream of a post-human future into an eternal battlefield. He saw his son's transgression, not his intent. It was the rage of a master artisan whose magnum opus had been shattered by the careless stumbling of an apprentice. He refused to believe the content of the warning, branding Magnus a fool and a traitor for what he had done. He dispatched Leman Russ and the Space Wolves not to investigate the claims, but to bring Magnus to Terra in chains to answer for his crime. This was the point of no return. A son had risked everything to save his father, and his father had condemned him for it. The failure was total. Malcador the Sigillite and Constantine Valdor, Captain General of the Legio Custodes, both understood the gravity of the warning, yet they could not sway the Emperor's wrath. Worse still, the order to censure Magnus was intercepted and subtly altered by the now corrupted Horus. The command was no longer to bring Magnus to heel, but to utterly destroy him and his legion. Russ, whose hatred of sorcery blinded his judgment, carried out his altered orders with savage glee. The burning of Prospero was not just the destruction of a world, it was the self-inflicted blinding of the Imperium. The one man who saw the full truth of the heresy was cast out. His legion shattered. His loyalty repaid with fire and death. Pushed into the arms of the very demons he had sought to understand, Magnus had no choice but to embrace the power that would save his remaining sons. The Emperor had lost another son, not to ambition, but to his own unforgiving pride. While these galactic-scale tragedies unfolded, smaller, more intimate failures were occurring within the command structure of the War Master's own legion. The corruption of Horus was not an instantaneous event. After his near death on Davin and his subsequent spiritual journey into the warp, guided by Erebus, he changed. The charismatic, warm, and approachable Lupercal began to recede, replaced by a colder, more calculating, and more ruthless War Master. This change was noticed by those closest to him, particularly the members of his inner council, the Mournival. Captains like Garviel Loken and Tarek Torgadon, men who loved Horus as a father, saw the shift. They questioned the introduction of warrior lodges into the Legion, secretive societies that preached a new, more aggressive philosophy. They grew wary of the influence of men like Erebus and the growing presence of the word-bearers. Their concerns were a nascent immune system, the Legion's own antibodies rising to fight the infection. But they were dismissed. To the other members of the Mournival, like the pragmatic Ezekiel Abaddon and the sycophantic Horus Aximand, Loken's and Torgadon's reservations were signs of weakness, a failure to embrace the new reality of the Crusade. They were accused of clinging to the past, of lacking the vision to understand the hard choices the War Master had to make. Their loyalty was questioned. This was a failure of the Legion's internal culture. The sons of Horus had been forged into a perfect weapon of conquest, a culture that prized aggression, success, and unwavering obedience to the War Master. There was no room for dissent, no mechanism for questioning the chain of command, especially not the Primarch himself. Loken's warnings were not escalated, they were contained. He and his loyalist brothers became a faction within their own legion, increasingly isolated as the majority embraced Horus's new path. The failure to heed their warnings would have its horrific conclusion in the blasted plains of Istvan III. Here, Horus would make his betrayal manifest, ordering the virus bombing of the planet's surface to exterminate the loyalist elements of his own legion and 3 others besides. Loken and Torgadon died there, not just as soldiers of the Imperium, but as prophets whose prophecies had been ignored. Their deaths represented the final silencing of the conscience of the 16th Legion. The infection had overcome the host. The atrocity of Istvan III was the heresy made real. The virus bombs that scoured the life from the planet were a declaration of war against the Imperium. Yet even then, the response from the loyalist Primarchs was hampered by a collective failure of imagination. When the first fragmented reports reached Terra, they were met with disbelief. Rogel Dorn, the Emperor's Praetorian, a man of unyielding logic and loyalty, could not conceive that his brother Horus, the greatest of them all, was capable of such a monstrous act. He began to fortify the Sol system, but he did so as a contingency, a precaution against a threat he could not fully accept as real. This initial hesitation, born of a misplaced faith in the bonds of brotherhood, was a costly error. It gave Horus time to consolidate his forces, to sway other undecided Primarchs to his cause, and to lay the groundwork for his assault on the galaxy. In the wider Imperium, the news spread not as a clear edict from Terra, but as a cascade of rumor, confused astropathic signals, and horrifying eyewitness accounts from the few survivors. Robert Guilliman, far out in the galactic east, began to muster his own forces, but the sheer distance and the unreliability of communication in a galaxy, now racked by warp storms, meant his response would be tragically slow. The failure here was systemic. The Imperium, for all its might, was a cumbersome beast. Its lines of communication were fragile, its bureaucracy immense. It was built for a methodical war of conquest, not a sudden explosive civil war where brother fought brother, and the very fabric of reality was a weapon. The Primarchs themselves were too accustomed to their autonomy. They were kings of their own domains, used to operating independently. The concept of a unified command structure to fight an enemy from within was alien to them. They were scattered, isolated, and forced to react to events rather than seizing the initiative. Istvan III should have been a clarion call that united the loyalists in a swift, decisive response. Instead, it sowed confusion and disbelief, buying the traitor war master his most precious commodity, time. The galaxy reeled, unable to comprehend that the hero of the Great Crusade was now its greatest nemesis. Even before the first shots were fired, there were moments, fleeting chances, where personal intervention might have averted the coming storm. The Primarchs were more than generals. They were brothers, bound by blood and shared experience. Yet in the years leading up to the heresy, this brotherhood proved to be tragically brittle. Consider Fulgrim, the Phoenician, Primarch of the Emperor's children. His path to damnation was a slow, agonizing descent, beginning with the discovery of a demonic blade that began to whisper to his pride and his obsession with perfection. He was a soul in torment, and he sought counsel from his closest brother, Ferrus Manus, of the Iron Hands. But their conversation was a dialogue of the deaf. Ferrus, pragmatic and unsubtle, saw Fulgrim's anxieties as a sign of weakness and met his confession with scorn. The bond between them, once ironclad, fractured under the weight of pride and misunderstanding. A hand of compassion might have pulled Fulgrim back from the brink. Instead, a harsh word pushed him further into the embrace of the demon that now possessed him. Then there was Sanguinius, the great angel, the Primarch of the Blood Angels. Of all the brothers, he was perhaps the most beloved, a figure of radiant nobility and profound empathy. He was also the keeper of a terrible secret, a genetic flaw in his legion, the red thirst that drove his sons to madness and bloodlust. On the world of Cygnus Prime, Horus, through his demonic allies, orchestrated a trap for the Blood Angels. There, Sanguinius was offered a choice: join Horus, and a cure for his legion's curse would be granted. It was a temptation of unimaginable power, aimed directly at his greatest shame and his deepest love for his sons. Sanguinius refused. He chose loyalty and damnation over treason and salvation. But the moment itself is revealing. Horus still believed he could turn his brother. The lines were not yet irrevocably drawn. What if, before this point, Sanguinius had sensed the darkness in Horus? What if he had flown not to Cygnus, but to the vengeful spirit, the War Master's flagship, and confronted him not as a soldier, but as a brother? It is a question that haunts the history of the age. The Primarchs operated in isolation, each consumed by their own campaigns and their own doubts. They failed to act as a family, to see the sickness growing in their midst and to intervene with the love and understanding that was perhaps the only force that could have stopped it. They were demigods who had forgotten how to be brothers. Ultimately, all these failures of communication, of empathy, of loyalty, of brotherhood can be traced back to a single, silent throne room on Terra. The Emperor's withdrawal from the Great Crusade was the primum mobile of the entire tragedy. His stated reason, the Webway Project, was a goal of breathtaking ambition to free humanity from its reliance on the treacherous tides of the warp for interstellar travel, thereby starving the chaos gods of their influence and ushering in a new phase of human evolution. It was a prize worth any cost. But the cost he chose to pay was his relationship with his sons. He created 20 beings of superhuman intellect, power, and emotion, each possessed of a desperate need for their father's approval. And then he left them. He treated them as instruments, as components in a grand machine, failing to understand that their human-like emotions, their pride, their jealousy, their love, their rage, were not trivial flaws but the very core of their beings. His silence was a void that chaos was only too eager to fill. His absence allowed Lorgar's faith to curdle into fanaticism. It allowed Horus's burden to become unbearable. It allowed his own fury at Magnus's transgression to overshadow the vital importance of the message he carried. The Emperor, the master of mankind, made the most human of errors, the error of a parent who believes his children will understand his sacrifices without explanation, who expects them to follow his path without guidance. He saw the grand strategic threat of chaos on a cosmic scale, but he failed to see it on the intimate personal scale where it truly mattered, in the hearts of his own sons. Malcador the Sigillite did his best to hold the Imperium together, but he was a regent, not a father. He could command loyalty, but he could not inspire the deep, instinctual love that might have anchored the Primarchs to the throne. The Emperor's great work was intended to save humanity, but in his single-minded pursuit of it, he created the very conditions for humanity's greatest cataclysm. The heresy was born in the silence that emanated from the Golden Throne. It was a failure of fatherhood on a scale that would doom a galaxy. The final and perhaps most damning failure belongs to the Primarchs themselves, both loyalist and traitor. They were brilliant strategists, warriors without peer, and leaders of men on a scale never before seen. But they were also flawed. Rogel Dorn's unyielding stoicism prevented him from seeing the emotional turmoil in his brothers. Robut Guilliman's genius for logistics and empire building was paired with a certain arrogance, a belief in the infallibility of his own systems. Leman Russ's savage loyalty was a blunt instrument, lacking the finesse to distinguish between a heretic and a brother making a terrible mistake. They saw each other as rivals, as allies, as pieces on a galactic chessboard. They failed to see each other as men. They could not comprehend that a being like Horus, the brightest star in the Imperial firmament, could be lonely, could be afraid, could be buckling under the psychological weight of commanding the greatest army in history. They saw the title, the War Master, and forgot the man, Lupercal. This collective blindness was not born of malice, but of their very nature. They were beings created for war, designed to be superior in every way. Empathy for the perceived weaknesses of others was not a quality the Great Crusade had rewarded. Strength, victory, and unwavering resolve were the currencies of their realm. And so when Horus began to change, when he began to voice doubts about the Emperor's purpose, when he began to listen to the whispers of new, darker philosophies, his brothers did not see a soul in peril. They saw a shift in strategy, a political realignment. They could not conceive that one of their number could truly fall to the temptations of the warp, could betray every oath he had ever sworn. That failure of imagination was the final lock on the cage. By the time they finally understood the truth, by the time Horus's ships hung in the skies of Istvan Fief and he slaughtered the legions sent to bring him to justice, it was too late. The bonds of brotherhood were not merely broken, they were revealed to have been an illusion all along. The heresy was not just a war of armies, but a war of ideas, and the loyalists entered that war utterly unprepared, their greatest weapon, their faith in each other, having already been shattered from within. And so it has been, across all the long centuries of blood and shadow. The Imperium that survived was not the one the Emperor had intended to build. It was a scarred, paranoid, and superstitious wreck. A galactic empire haunted by the ghosts of its own failings. The story of the Horus Heresy is told and retold, a foundational myth of betrayal and sacrifice. But it is too often framed as the tragedy of one man's fall from grace. The truth is more severe. Horus Lupercal did not fall alone. He was pushed. He was pushed by a father's silence and a brother's shame. He was pushed by the ignored counsel of his most loyal sons and the celebrated lies of his most treacherous advisors. He was pushed by a galaxy that placed the weight of its future on his shoulders and then looked away, failing to notice when that weight began to crush him. In the end, what remains is the devastating knowledge that it did not have to be this way. The galaxy in flames was not an inevitability. It was the sum total of 1,000 moments of choice, 1,000 failures to act. It is the story of a warning that arrived but was not believed. It is the story of a cry for help that was answered with punishment. It is the story of a brotherhood that valued strength over compassion and obedience over truth. This is the burden the Imperium carries. Not just the memory of the traitor, but the indelible, soul-deep shame of knowing that he was once a brother and they let him go. Now, as darkness closes in once more and the echoes of that ancient war still resound, the question is not whether the Imperium can survive its enemies, but whether it can ever truly survive itself. The ashes of Istvan, of Prospero, of Terra itself stand as a silent, eternal testament to a dream of unity that was undone not by a great enemy from without, but by the small, tragic, and unforgivable failures of the heart within. The war was lost long before the first shot was ever fired.